All right, greetings and welcome. It is episode 2.3 of the Unnamed Bracketology podcast. My name is Kerry Miller, joined as always by my good friend Graham Dorn. You're still on Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky. Between the two of us, we're helping the world learn about bracketology. We have mostly recovered from Feast Week. We want to do some takeaways from the first month. Our last pod, we were looking ahead to Feast Week. Now we're going to look behind, conference by conference, and we will start at the top with what is clearly the best conference thus far, the SEC. What are your biggest takeaways thus far, 4 weeks into the season on the SEC? I should note we're recording this at like 8 p.m. Eastern. The ACC SEC challenge has like just started. We don't know any of the results yet, but with that, go ahead.
Well, I think the number one takeaway I have is that Kerry said clearly the best conference is the SEC,
Yeah.
and that would not have been the case before the season. We all knew the SEC was going to be a top contender, but they have completely blown away the competition on what's the best conference. And I think it's not just Auburn and Tennessee as number one seed contenders, and potentially even looking at teams like Alabama to join that conversation. I think for me, what really separates the SEC from the other leagues in the country is the depth. You look at Georgia has been good out of conference. You look at LSU going on the road, beating Kansas State, Ole Miss getting that neutral court win against BYU. I think it's really look at Oklahoma. They won an
Yeah.
MTE, right? Like they're undefeated. Who would have thought Oklahoma would be undefeated coming out as the Battle for Atlantis champions?
I'm still struggling to remember that Oklahoma's SEC now, man. Yeah. But yeah, I that was shocking. I had no inclination that they were going to win that. They would have been like my sixth pick.
Yeah, I think that's for me the big thing with the SEC is it's just all the way from top to bottom. They have one seed contenders and they have multiple one seed contenders, and then they have teams down competing for 12th place in the SEC and still thinking, yeah, I could be an NCAA tournament team at 12th place in the SEC.
Yeah.
That's how good this league is this year. I don't think they'll end up getting that. If I had to guess, they'll probably get 10 bids, maybe 11. But is it crazy to say that the 12th team in the SEC could get in? I don't think it's crazy.
Yeah. Arkansas is my first team out right now, and they would have been the 12th SEC team in. To your point, aside from South Carolina, which I believe is like 135 in the initial net, the other 15 teams in the SEC, a collective 16 and 12 against Quad One. And the only loss outside of that group was Texas Tech losing at UCF, which was like they're 86, and that could be Quad One in a week. Like they might not have anything even resembling a bad loss as an entire conference. So yeah, I have 11 in. Arkansas is just barely on the outside. LSU's close. Vanderbilt is even kind of sort of in the conversation as the somewhat clearly second worst team in the league. So yeah, the SEC just top to bottom is insane. I have five in my top 10 overall. I don't know where you landed on Florida, Kentucky, Alabama, but five top 10, eight top 26, and 11 in the field. An amazing start for the SEC. Cannot possibly ask for better. But that segues us to the Big 12. This was supposed to be the league to have five in the top 10, and they do not. What, aside from Kansas, is still good? They are still clearly either number one overall or number two overall. I don't think there's any dispute there from anyone. But beyond Kansas, it gets iffy in a hurry real quick. We just watched Cincinnati lose to Villanova. So now all of a sudden, what was probably the third best, resume in the conference has now gotten worse. So what is your biggest takeaway from the Big 12 thus far?
I think my biggest takeaway is pretty much what you said. That's not quite as strong at the top as we were expecting. But on that note, I do think it's important to think about how close some of these victories were to being big wins for the Big 12. So Iowa State looked like they had Auburn
Oh yeah.
on a neutral court.
That was the game of the year.
How does the narrative change if Iowa State ends up winning Maui instead because they just don't blow that lead?
Yeah.
Houston had Auburn and Alabama both in trouble, couldn't get either of them. If Houston wins one of those games, let alone both of them, how different is the narrative? So I think that's kind of part of it is I'm not losing sight of the fact that even though Iowa State and Houston have taken on four collective losses, those are still two
Yeah.
really good teams, and I expect them to be top three seeds at the end of the year. Would I be surprised if one of them falls out of the top three? No. Right now, I have Houston as a five seed.
Mhm.
I don't think they're going to stay there. I think it's just a matter of time before Houston starts to rise back up the bracket. But again, I think my biggest takeaway for the Big 12 is what the SEC is what I thought the Big 12 might be. And that's they're weaker at the top than I thought they were going to be.
Yeah.
And they're also weaker at the what I thought the cut line would be. I thought Kansas State coming into the season
Oof.
was going to be like a 9 seed caliber team. That's where I had them in my preseason bracket. They don't look like an NCAA tournament
No.
team at all. And I think even if you look at UCF, they got that big win over Texas A&M earlier this season on opening night. Looked like maybe UCF sneaks into that conversation. They haven't really quite looked like an NCAA tournament team overall either. Maybe the one bright side for the Big 12 is Arizona State
Yeah.
has put together some impressive results that we weren't expecting.
Yeah. I have Arizona State as a 10 seed. I think you have them as a 7, and I can't argue it aside from their metrics, but we'll get to that later in the tough to seed segment. Yeah, Arizona might suck. They're 3-4 and really have not looked good in most of their games. The just hand the ball to Caleb Love and let him do his thing plan. It's working about as well as it did last year at times. Um, Already mentioned Cincinnati. They were, for both of us, our top 4 seed about 7 minutes ago. They no longer are. And Cincinnati was a big question mark for me coming into the season just because of how pathetically weak their non-conference schedule was. This game against Villanova was, still is, but was from the beginning of the year like the strongest thing on their non-conference schedule, and they just lost it. So what are they going to do now? I think they still play Xavier and Dayton, and I think those are both home games. At the very least, they're not a far trip within Ohio for either of them, but they're probably not going to have certainly a quad 1 win. They might not even have a quad 2 win heading into Big 12 play. So Cincinnati, big question mark now. Baylor, when Baylor doesn't show up, it really doesn't show up. So they have two just like got stomped losses, granted to teams who I presently have as 1 seeds, Tennessee and Gonzaga, but still that factors into your rating. Like Baylor is now something like 25th on KenPom. I'm not sure where they are in the net. Not that the net should matter in early December, but and then Houston, going back to them. I think they could be this year's Michigan State from last year, which started out number 4, was supposed to be a 1 seed. I don't know, man. I mean, the kid they got from Oklahoma, the point guard. Oh my God, what is his name? Who's on? He's not Jamal Shed. Okay, it's clear at this point they don't have Jamal Shed anymore. The guys who were supposed to step up, JoJo Tugler, Terrence Arsenault, Javier Francis, it's not happening for them. I don't think they have it. Now, the 3 losses they have were close games against quality teams. I'm not throwing in the towel on Houston, but they might not be as good anymore. And the predictive metrics are not willing to believe that yet because they're top 5 across the board. Net, KenPom, BPI, not Sagarin, Torvik. I'm going back 3 years with Sagarin, but I don't know. I'm not completely sold on Houston, but in addition to what you said about Arizona State, West Virginia might actually be kind of good. So I think they have 2 teams that are tournament caliber that we weren't expecting. They just don't have anywhere near as many title contenders as we were expecting, which is fine. They're still going to get 9, 10 teams in probably, if only because the ACC and Big East are not. You have anything else on the Big 12 for you?
No, I just think with Houston, the one thing they have that I don't think Michigan State had last year is a really high floor.
Yeah, I agree.
They just have a floor that I think is they can't really go past because anytime your defense is that good, teams are going to struggle to score against you. And I just think they're going to fall into some wins where they're not playing particularly well. Just they're going to win those games that Michigan State probably didn't last year. Last year, Michigan State had one blowout win over Baylor and nothing
Yeah.
else that impressed the tournament committee. But like you're saying, their efficiency metrics were still quite good. I think Houston's going to be in the tournament no matter how many games they lose because their
That's
efficiency
impressive.
metrics are going to. I mean, in my opinion,
There's no blowing out Houston. That doesn't
they're
happen. Yeah,
it's not going to
yeah,
happen. Like their efficiency metrics are going to be so high, and if it push comes to shove, they're in the committee room and they're like, okay, we got to choose the best teams. It's like, yeah, they lost to Alabama in overtime. Yeah, they lost to Auburn. Could have won that one. Like lost to San Diego State in overtime, right? Like
right. All
these
close
games could have
games. Yep.
easily gone the other way. I just think at the end of the day, the floor for Houston is really high.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. Moving on to the Big Ten. I think the biggest takeaway is that Oregon as they are in football, might be the best team in the conference. What did they win? The Players Era Festival. If we had actually done like full bracket predictions for that tournament, seventh place, probably predicting them to beat Notre Dame in the seventh
That's
place
exactly
game,
what I was going to say.
and they won it. Wow, I'm amazed by them. What else have you got from the Big Ten thus far?
I think Purdue is pretty similar to where I had them in the preseason. In preseason, I had them as a 4 seed, but I was thinking more so along the lines of somebody's going to have to win the Big Ten.
Yeah,
And when that team wins it, they're just going to naturally have a bump from the wins that it took to get there.
yep,
And so that's why I wasn't really looking at Purdue as like a 2 or 3 seed contender. And I still don't quite believe in them as like a 2 seed contender, even though right now I have them as my top 3 seed. But at the same time, they actually are better than I thought they were going to
yeah,
be. That win over Alabama's really good. The Big Ten's just deep. I think they're going to get a lot of teams in the tournament, not necessarily because they have a lot of great teams. I don't think they have many great teams, but they have a lot of very good teams. And when a lot of very good teams play each other, there's bound to be a quality win for somebody coming out of each and every one of those
yep.
games. So I think they're just going to rack up quality wins, and at the end of the day, the tournament committee is gonna they're going to be looking for who do we put in these final spots in the bracket, and they'll look at some Big Ten team and be like, well,
Yeah.
they were 4-5 against Quadrant One, pretty good, whereas this other team from the SEC was 2-9 because they kept losing to Tennessee and Auburn and Alabama.
Yeah,
And it doesn't necessarily make one team better than the other, but the numbers are what the numbers are. So I think that's really going to help the Big Ten when it comes to Selection Sunday.
yeah, that's a good point. Big Ten's going to have a lot of wins above bubble this year. The big thing I wrote down: 12 teams in the Ken Palm top 50, none higher than 14th. So that's exactly what you're saying. Just a lot of Sweet 16 caliber maybe teams, a lot of second round teams, not a lot of title contenders, but they're going to get a lot of bids. Indiana might suck. Wisconsin won the Greenbrier tip off that I was thinking maybe we should go to. That ended up being a pretty good game against Pitt. What do we feel about Rutgers, right? Resume wise, no, they're not even close. They're like 75th across the board because of that loss to Kennesaw State. They were very impressive in the Players Era Festival, though. Beat Notre Dame, lost to Alabama, lost to Texas A&M, but those were both very close games. They obviously have the talent in Bailey and Harper that we thought they would have. Do they have enough around them to actually win some quality games? Because they've now, this was their non-conference schedule. Like they're not going to play anybody outside of league play, but I think they have Ohio State and Penn State coming up this weekend. Would it surprise you at all if they win both of those games? No.
It wouldn't. What I think the concern for Rutgers, for me at least, is as you mentioned, the opportunities that are already gone.
Yeah.
And I think Rutgers is going to fall into that group of the Michigans, the Iowas, the Northwesterns that can win on any given day in the Big Ten, but also lose on any given day in the Big Ten. And so what's ultimately going to separate those teams out are the ones that have the best wins, which includes non-conference, which Rutgers doesn't have.
Yeah.
And I think it's also going to be ones that have the best efficiency metrics. That's going to be a little bit of a differentiator. I think you're going to have teams like Michigan that might be a little bit higher on the efficiency side, whereas Rutgers has already harmed themselves in that way. Rutgers could potentially be having a combination of some of the worst efficiency metrics amongst the Big Ten bubble teams and the least amount of non-conference wins. And when you look at those, it's just like, why would we include them in the tournament? Not why would we exclude them? Why would we even include them when we have teams that have these quality wins out of conference? And I think that could ultimately be their problem. I think they're going to have to be on the upper half of the Big Ten. I don't think splitting the Big Ten being, ninth place, 10th place is going to work for them
Yeah.
because they haven't done enough so far.
Yeah. They probably need to go 12-8 in league play, or is it 22 games now? I can't keep track of all these changes, but they need to be above 500. Whereas, if Wisconsin or Purdue goes 10-10, they're still going to comfortably get in just because of what they've done thus far this season. All right, Big East, we got to talk UConn. What the hell happened?
Dan Hurley got mad. I know that happened.
Yes, he did.
I think UConn is still in good shape for the tournament. Don't get me wrong. I think if I had a guess, they're probably going to end up as a 4 or 5 seed. I lean 5 seed on Selection Sunday. I know that's a lot of projecting forward,
Where do you have them projected right now,
but
Graham?
right now, I don't have them in the tournament, and they don't deserve to be in the
No.
tournament. There's absolutely nothing that UConn has done that they can point to and say, we did this well. Even if you wanted to say, well, losing to Memphis is fine. That was a competitive game on a neutral court. Okay, Dayton's pretty good. You may have gotten blown out, but think about Caravan. He has a head injury. And it's like, well, you lost to Colorado.
Yeah.
Like, there's just nowhere to go. And you can't look at it and say, well, at least they've racked up some decent Q3 wins. Lemoyne is arguably the best win
Yeah,
that
it's
UConn has on their schedule.
all at home against Ken Palm, outside top 300.
I
Like
mean, it is
it's
the
yeah,
absolute dregs that
yeah,
they've been playing in their non-conference schedule outside of Maui. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of risk when you go to a tournament like Maui. But as you saw with Auburn, there's a whole lot of reward as well. I just think UConn didn't take advantage. And the question for me with UConn is not whether they can score the ball. They're going to score the ball just fine this year. Are they going to learn how to defend in time to make a run? Honestly, I think national championship seems like a step too far at this
yeah.
point. And that seems crazy because they were one of the favorites to win the title coming into the season. But it just seems like even if they get that defense better, would it be like Duke 2022, where it's just good enough to get you into that conversation, but ultimately you know it's not a great defense? And I think that's what UConn is almost hoping to become at this point. Like that seems to me the best their defense could be. And if their defense isn't better, which I just don't think it's going to get that much better, I just don't see them as a realistic title contender anymore. I do think they'll land at that 4 or 5 seed at the end of the day, but I don't think they're the best team in the Big East. I think Marquette's the best team in the Big
Yeah.
East.
I think we very much took for granted that, what they had with Adama Sanogo and Donovan Clingan, we're just like, whoa, Samson Johnson's going to be that guy. He's not that guy. Like Terrace Reed Jr. is clearly their better option. He'll probably, if he's not already starting, he probably will be soon because, Johnson is similar to what I was saying with Houston. Like, Tugler Arsenault didn't step up. Like, he hasn't made that leap that he needed to make. Aiden Mahaney's doing nothing for them. The transfer from St. Mary's, like they didn't hit on what they needed to hit on. And again, we only saw them play 3 games of any consequence. If Dan Hurley doesn't blow up against Memphis, if they win that game and then lose, what would have been? They would have played Michigan State and then North Carolina. If that's where they're at, if they're 1-2 with a win over Memphis and those 2 losses, like we probably still have them projected for like a 3 or a 4 seed. We wouldn't be that worried about it, but it unraveled so fast. And now we have nothing but questions for them. I do think with the Dayton game, like even before it happened, I was like, this could get ugly because they were playing at midnight on the East Coast after playing the first 2 games at whatever, like 9 a.m. Hawaii time, and they were already just like beaten down. Then, as you mentioned, the caravan concussion, it's just it piled on in a hurry. I'm not that worried about the margin of the Dayton result, but for them to have not gotten a single win in that tournament is insane to me.
I mean, the good news for UConn within the context of the Big East is they don't have to be great
Yeah.
to end up being second or third place in the Big East.
Yeah.
Like that could happen without even really doing anything all that terrific. And do I think the tournament committee is going to limit the Big East to 2 teams like I currently have in my bracket? No. I think they're going to end up getting probably 4 bids, would be my
I
guess.
think I have 4 in.
And as long as UConn's in that second or third spot, they're probably going to get a decent seed. It would just naturally come with some decent wins, right? Like if you are going to finish second or third in the Big East, you're probably getting some road wins over teams like Creighton or Xavier that will look pretty good. Maybe not terrific, but those are still good quality wins. So I think UConn's going to make the field. I'd be very surprised if they don't. The one warning sign I have for UConn is they've got 3 very important non-conference games coming up, and none of them are that easy, right? Like, could I see them losing at home to Baylor without Caravan? Like, yeah, I could see that. Could I see them losing in Texas? Yeah, I could see that. Like, if
Absolutely.
they
Yeah,
don't
losing to
pick up one of the
Gonzaga.
next 3, I think the path to a tournament bid will be nearly insurmountable because I just don't think they're a national championship caliber team. And you'd basically have to be a national championship caliber team to overcome no quality non-conference wins and 6
Yeah.
losses in non-conference play.
And it feels crazy to even speculate like, oh, they might not make the tournament. What happened to the last team that went back to back? Florida didn't make the tournament in whatever that was, 2008.
Well, UNC was, and after 2022, they opened up preseason number
Yeah.
1. They missed the tournament. part of that was not performing well
Yeah.
early on in the season. Like these games really do matter. And I think a lot of people that aren't huge college basketball fans don't really realize how important and critical some of these non-conference results are. When the committee gets together, they don't say, well, this game happened in March, this game happened in November. They really do look at those as all being quality wins or unfortunately sometimes bad
Yeah,
losses.
there's no last 12 games metric on the team sheets anymore. November games count the same as March. So everybody commented on all of our brackets that we're putting out, like, oh, it's too early for this. No, these games matter. Shut up. So obviously UConn was the biggest misstep, but Creighton also might not be good. I mean, the first game of the season against UTRGV, they needed Ryan Kalkbrenner to score all, was it 49 points he scored? Needed all of them. And teams have had no problem shutting him down lately. Like for all of the like jokes that, no escalators or all the UConn people on Twitter put about Ryan Kalkbrenner just big, that's what he's looked like the last few games. Like, was it the Nebraska game? He took one shot and it was a 3-pointer. How the hell does that imagine Zach Edey taking one shot in a game? Would never happen. Like he's not that guy that they need him to be, and they don't have that much around him. I'm skeptical that Creighton's going to make the tournament at this point.
He's also they play Kansas tomorrow night. I was looking at the spread on that one. It's 3.5. It's a dangerous game to go into Omaha versus a desperate Creighton team. But if you look at how they match up, man, like Hunter Dickinson, for all of his defensive liabilities, if he's guarding Kalkbrenner, like that's a guy that he can guard,
Yeah.
another big 7-footer. So from a matchup standpoint, I'm just struggling to see where Creighton's gonna get enough scoring. They're gonna have to play defense, and we'll see.
They're gonna have to get the Chai Health Center 3-point magic going. Like
Yeah,
they have to
and
shoot
they have done
50%
this plenty of
for
times over the
sure.
years, so let's not pretend like it's not possible.
Yeah.
They shot 42 3-pointers against Nebraska. How different does that game look if they hit a much higher percentage? So it's
Yeah.
it's definitely possible, and in some ways, a good recipe for an upset is a team that shoots a ton of 3-pointers, because some days you just happen to make them.
Yeah.
But from a matchup standpoint, I think Creighton could be in trouble tomorrow, and then if they lose that one, what has Creighton really
Yeah.
done headed into Big East play? And I think the biggest problem for a lot of these Big East teams is it's not what you haven't done so far. It's the combination of what you haven't done and the lack of opportunities in Big
Yeah.
East play. You anticipated that there'd be a lot of quality win opportunities, and there's just not going to be quite as many as you think. Like, again, those road games against teams like Xavier, they're still going to be around. But whereas that could have been like an elite win
Yeah.
at the beginning of the season, now that's potentially a win over a team that's not making the tournament. So it's still a value. It's just not worth as much as you thought it was going to be.
And the games against Seton Hall and Providence look a whole lot less like you lose one of those, you're screwed because those teams have taken a major tumble. All right, elsewhere in the Big East, even St. John's really hasn't done anything, and I believe they're my second highest seeded Big East team, and I think I have them as an 8 seed. So, like you were saying, I do still have UConn in just like on principle. We'll get to them on the tough to seed stuff too, but St. John's beat Virginia and New Mexico, lost to Baylor and Georgia. Haven't done much. I have Xavier in, but they might not be any good. They got destroyed by Michigan, barely beat South Carolina State. What the hell was that? The only Q1 win, aside from Marquette, which has three of them. Can you name it from the Big East?
Butler.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, Butler's close. But they beat Mississippi State. They have two other quad two wins. They also had a terrible loss to Austin P, but they're probably like the fifth best team in the league right now, and that's not saying much.
I just was doing some slight reseeding today before coming over here because now that the net and KPI and the NCAA's wins above bubble WAB metric have all been released in the past few days, there's more data to look at than there was previously. So it's resulted in little small variations, not huge changes to where I had teams in the bracket. But one of them that moved up was now Butler is over here looking really good from a
Yeah.
quad standpoint. Yeah, they got one bad loss to Austin P, but if you look at those wins, they're really looking very good
Yeah.
from a metric standpoint. So I think Butler is one of those teams that I have my eye on as a potential tournament team.
All right. ACC, I think the biggest surprise for sure is that Pitt is at number 5 in the net with three quad one wins. Nobody saw that coming before the season. What are your other thoughts on the ACC thus far, aside from that it's not good?
Well, I'd like to follow up on Pitt because
Yeah.
I have actually, over the past couple weeks, been saying watch them as a sneaky two-seed contender.
Okay.
Right now, I have them on the 4 line. They were one of those teams that had the 5 line earlier this week, and now that more metrics came out, including net placing them number 5 in the first net, I've moved them up to the 4 line and actually all the way up to my second 4 seed. But I think Pitt is, they have, sometimes it's just about the schedules and the team. And what I mean by that is, I think Pitt is a very good basketball team, but I also think they have a winnable schedule. And so I think they could end up with an impressive overall record.
Sure.
They've already proven they can win on the road. And then you look at UNC and Duke, and those are really the only two teams that look to be super great
Mhm.
outside of Pitt and the ACC. So what happens if they steal one or two of those games? All of a sudden they could be like Miami in 2013,
Yeah.
where you look at it and it's like, yeah, maybe they didn't have a ton of great wins, but they won the ACC regular season. And look, it's still the same conference with Duke and UNC. So I think if they win one or two of those, that's enough to back up the resume compared to already having that big road win in the bank against Ohio State. So when you look at Pitt, I think they could potentially not just stop at the 4 line that they're at. I think they could move up all the way to a 2 seed. I really doubt they could be a 1 seed. I don't see that in them, but a 2 seed I think is certainly attainable for Pitt.
I believe it. Duke, UNC, Pitt, Clemson, Louisville. Those are the only teams in the net top 60 in this 18-team league. That's not great. Those five teams are combined 7-9 against quad one. No other losses outside of that group. That's good. That's a good sign for a five-bid ACC. No clue who else outside of that group is possibly going to contend, though. The rest of the ACC is 2-16 against quad one, has 6 quad 2 losses, 6 quad 3 losses, and 3 quad 4 losses. The ACC is a hot mess, and even North Carolina already has 3 losses, doesn't have any great wins on its radar aside from the crazy comeback against Dayton, which I mean, if beating Dayton is the best thing North Carolina does in non-conference play, that says a lot. No offense to Dayton, North Carolina's supposed to win that game. Other teams you wanted to hit on? Anyone? Maybe Dayton, although that you said they were playing and trailing right now, so maybe we don't want to discuss them.
Well, I think there are a couple teams that I think would be interesting to talk about, but I kind of feel like we should move them to the tough to seed
Let's do it.
conversation
Tough to
because
seed.
that's where it falls in. I think San Diego State is one that immediately pops into mind for me.
All right, so as bracketologists, when we say a team is tough to seed, what does that mean? Because it is something we fall back on a lot anytime we're just like, that feels right, but also feels wrong. And then the fans of that team that we say are tough to seed, they yell at us because they think it's just a cop out. But what does it mean if a team is tough to seed? Let's educate the audience.
Well, let's show what's not tough to seed because that's a good way to explain it.
Auburn,
I look at
Kansas.
Auburn and I say, wow, they've got quality wins. They've got great resume metrics. They've got a great net ranking. They've got great performance metrics. Obvious where they should be in the field, right? Like there's no doubt they should be a 1 seed. Then you look at teams like San Diego State, and their numbers are all over the place. They just came out 62nd in the net today.
Yep.
And they are looking at a win against Houston on a neutral court. And at the same time, they only have 3 wins against Division One right now. And when you look at their wins, other than Houston, they weren't impressive from an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah.
They're actually unimpressive, like the UC San Diego game. If you look at it from what you would expect a tournament caliber team to do, not an impressive performance. In fact, if that was a better opponent, you would expect them to lose that game. They
Yeah.
played not like an NCAA tournament team in that game. So that's where it becomes tough to seed because you have somebody who has a resume that is so varied that you could see the committee being like, guys, this is San Diego State, coached by Brian Dutcher, and they have a neutral court win against Houston. Obviously, they should be a 5 seed. Like, you could see the committee saying that. You could also see the committee saying, guys,
62 in the net.
they're 62 in the net. They almost lost to UC San Diego. They only have 3 wins against Division One. So
If that's still true in March, we're not debating them
yeah,
anymore.
but that's the point is like
Yeah.
when we say a team is tough to seed, it's because the committee could rightfully look at one part of their resume and say, this is what we want to seed this team on. They could also look at another part of the resume and say, this is what we want to seed this team on. That's what makes them tough to seed. Because if you look at a team like Auburn, it doesn't matter what part of the resume you look at, they're falling in the same exact category. So tough to seed isn't a cop out for bracketologists. It's basically a way of us telling you this team has a resume that is all over the place. And so ultimately, we tend to balance that out in our evaluations. And that's what the committee tends to do, but not always. Sometimes they pick out a certain part of that resume that they don't like. Nevada last year, a lot of people had them on the 7 line. They dropped down to a 10 seed in the tournament. And because the committee saw a part of their
Yeah.
resume that they didn't like, that was a tough to seed team.
It's probably
And that's how the
BPI.
committee did it. And there were times we were talking about Nevada possibly even as a 5 seed last year, and they ended up as a 10 seed.
Yeah.
So when you have a tough to seed team, it just means the committee can realistically put them all over the map. And it's not that the committee's necessarily wrong, even if you disagree with it.
Well,
There's a basis for why they did it.
the committee can't ever be wrong. They make the rules. But yeah, sometimes tough to seed is just the data doesn't match up with your eyes, and we're not supposed, there's no eye test anymore, but still there is that element of 12 humans in a room. Is it still 12? I don't 12 people in a room discussing a team and like how they've looked lately, how they look at full strength, what they, all this stuff. Sometimes it just doesn't match in that way. And other times, like you're saying, just the data itself doesn't coalesce or whatever. So I wrote down a few teams who just their resumes are all over the place. UConn, certainly one of them. 38th in the net, 21 in the predictive metrics, 161st in resume metrics. Not a tournament caliber team as far as that is concerned. Arizona State, who we have like three seed lines different, and even that was only after I saw your bracket. I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point on Arizona State. 32 in the net, 11.3 resume metrics, which speaks volumes to the quality of their wins, but they're 60th in the predictive metrics. You already hit on San Diego State, also Houston, 20th in the net, 3.3 in predictives, 84th in the resume metrics. And again, it's early in the season. I think at this point, certainly the, Ken Palm, BPI, and Torvik are, if not twice as important as resume metrics, 3 times as important at this point. Like as the season progresses, those resume metrics make more sense and become more important. So I'm not paying all that much attention to KPI or SOR yet, but by the end of the year, those are my fallback numbers. But yeah, if the predictives and the resume metrics are divergent, that's when it's tough to see them. It's that simple, and we're not like just full of crap and saying I threw a dart at your team. It just is tough to find a spot for teams sometimes.
And sometimes the committee will look at those divergences and they'll say, we're going to split the difference.
Yeah.
And sometimes they say, no, like Wisconsin in 2022 is a good example of this. The committee saw some predictives that weren't very good. Same thing with Providence. Their predictives were not good for either Wisconsin or Providence. The committee says, but look, those resume
Yeah,
metrics.
have a three
Those teams
seed.
are
Good
good.
luck.
Have a 3 seed, have a good 4 seed. There you go. And you just never know what they're going to do in that regard. So that's why those teams are tough to see.
All right, we'll go relatively rapid fire on national championship odds just because I have an article on this coming out tomorrow. So I've already done the research, but the AP top 10 teams have their DraftKings odds to win it all. We're not sponsored by DraftKings. It's just what I used. We're not sponsored by anybody. Maybe we get sponsored by bourbon at some point. But we'll start at the top. Kansas, number one in the AP poll, 15-1 DraftKings odds buying for sure, right? They're like sixth best odds. That makes no sense whatsoever. Because before the season, we were in agreement. It's probably Duke, Kansas, or Connecticut. Kansas beat Duke. Connecticut might stink, and their odds have gone up from 1,100 to 1,500. Help me out. Why? Why is Kansas fading in the odds?
I think if you look at it from a predictive standpoint, you mentioned, right?
They're
They
like
six
7
best
to
odds. Well, that's
yeah.
exactly what their efficiency metrics would tell you. The difference to me, and this is my looking at it from a standpoint of who I think is most likely to win a national championship, and why I think that's a buy at that level, isn't because I think Kansas has a super high ceiling. I think they're their ceiling isn't that much higher than where they currently are. But I heard Rob Doster mention something on Field 68, which I thought was a great point, which is
Not
Kansas,
sponsored by them either.
not sponsored by them either, that Kansas has arguably the best floor in the country. And I think there's something to that. What I think oftentimes when we're thinking about national champions, we come at it from the wrong standpoint. We're often thinking about like, well, what if this team does this and what if this team does this? And it's like that's not how the NCAA tournament works. You got to win 6 games in a row. And actually, I'll use Kansas as a good example from 2022 of what a national champion actually has to do versus what you think they have to do. Okay, they start out versus Texas Southern. It's pretty much an automatic win, right?
You got the whole thing memorized. You Jayhawk.
But then they get to Creighton.
Yeah.
They didn't play well against Creighton at any point in the game, but they still sneak out a 3-point victory over Creighton. So they didn't have to play well in 4 straight halves of basketball to be in the Sweet 16 because they're a 1 seed, which Kansas could very easily be a 1 seed this year. They go against Providence. Don't particularly play well against Providence either. Sneak out another victory. Go against Miami. They're down 5 at halftime in the Elite Eight against 10 seed Miami. Yes, I do remember all this stuff. And then in the second half, they absolutely blow out Miami. So their first good half of basketball occurs in the second half of the Elite Eight. And now they're already to the Final Four. And they get to the Final Four, play a terrific half of basketball against Villanova in the first half, and that's enough to beat Villanova. They don't even have to play a great second half because they played so well in the first. And then against UNC, they're absolutely brutal in the first half. They're down 15 in the championship game at halftime, and then they play a great second half. What does that mean? They played 3 great halves of basketball. One against Miami, one against Villanova, one against North Carolina. And this is to the point about this Kansas team. When they have a high floor like that 2022 Kansas team does, you don't have to play great to win a national championship. You have to play great at the right times.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that's wrong. 15-1 doesn't make sense for a team who really arguably might only have to play 3 great halves of basketball to win a national championship. And that Kansas team, I think, showed against Duke and UNC in the first half against UNC,
Yeah.
and then arguably at the very beginning of the first half against Duke and the very beginning of the second half against Duke, they're capable of turning it on and being really impressive at times. And that's all they would have to do to win the national title is stay at that high floor and just turn it on at the exact right times when they need it in the tournament. So that's why I think that's wrong.
Yeah. The big thing for me with Kansas is they're way, way, way more depth than last year. Like when they lost McCullough, they were screwed. Had no choice to like we expected them to lose almost in the first round at that point. But now, like if Shaq Moore gets healthy at some point for real this time, like they go 9 deep, no problem. Like they're a quality deep team, and I think that's what you need in the tournament. Like I look more so at who's your seventh and eighth best player than who your best and second best players are, because at some point you're going to need them. And I think, if Dickinson gets into foul trouble early in the first half of a game and Flory Badunga has to come in and play 30 minutes, that's fine. It can work for them. So yeah, I think I wouldn't want them if they were the betting favorite, but for them to not even be top 5 is kind of outrageous. Speaking of betting favorite, Auburn, number 2 in the AP poll. They have the best odds right now. I always fade the best odds team at this point in the season. I actually looked it up that 1 month into the season, the only team in the last decade to win the championship that was number 1 on KenPom was Baylor during the 2020-2021 year. And that was like the only juncture of the regular season that they were ahead of Gonzaga. They were 2 to Gonzaga's 1 the whole year. It's usually a top 5 KenPom team 1 month into the season, but it's never number 1. And I think that's just random. It's just whatever. But I don't think it's a thing of peaking too early or whatever. But I don't, my concern, what did I write down? Point guard play, Auburn. I don't know that they have it. They have 8 seniors in their rotation, and they're probably going to be relying pretty heavily on Tom Pettiford as a freshman point guard at some point in the season. And that concerns me with them.
Yeah, I think do I have the trust in Auburn that I probably should? The reality is no. I probably should have more trust in them. I do think Auburn is, if I were personally putting it together, I would have them as the 3rd best odds. So very, very good
Yeah.
national championship caliber team. And frankly, who usually wins the tournament? It's usually like the third best team like going into the tournament, right? Like that's
Yeah.
usually it's like that you get that like third overall number one seed. That's often the team that ends up winning it. But I think Auburn, for me, do I have the level of trust to place them as the overall favorite? I wouldn't have them quite there,
Yeah,
so I would not at
I think it's a bit
that point.
aggressive. We'll go quick on Tennessee and Kentucky because they are playing tonight, and maybe they'll lose and we'll feel differently in the morning. But 17 to 1 on Tennessee, 20 to 1 on Kentucky. It's around like seventh and ninth best odds.
From an efficiency metric standpoint, you'd say Tennessee should be better there, but do
Yeah.
I trust Tennessee? No, I don't. I think that's a perfect price point
Yeah.
because I don't trust them to be better than that. At the same time, you can't have a team with that great of efficiency be worse.
Yeah. Tennessee, 26 trips to the tournament, never been to the Final Four. They're coached by Rick Barnes, who's been to the Final Four once in 28 trips to the tournament. At a certain point, that just becomes too onerous.
Same deal every time, to be frank. They're going to run into a game, in my opinion, they're going to run into a game where they don't score, and then we're going to
Yeah.
be like, oh my gosh, this defensive, offensive juggernaut just went out of the tournament. How'd that happen? Well, same thing as always happens. So
You buying Kentucky yet? They've only really played Duke, and I mean, they were down 10 in that game. It was tied with 15 seconds left, and then Cooper Flag pissed his pants. How do we feel about Kentucky as fourth in the nation and top 10 title
I
odds?
would probably have them closer to like 25 to 1. But at the same time, I think they're pretty close to where they should be. I think the problem with a team like Kentucky is they could be overly reliant on the three ball in the tournament. And if you're Villanova 2018, that works great. Are they going to be Villanova 2018? I don't know because I don't know that they have the interior presence either that Villanova team had. And frankly, I think that could end up being their downfall. Is just a day where they don't shoot that well, and they potentially maybe they run into a team with a great big man. That could be a real problem
Yeah,
too. Over 6 games, it's probably going to happen at some point.
yeah. I agree with you. They should be 25, 30, somewhere in that range. You're definitely paying a Kentucky tax if you take them there. Marquette at 40 to 1. What the hell? That's a clear buy. Let's talk Marquette for a second.
Like this one really just jumps out at me is I'm not saying Marquette should be anywhere close to like 10 to 1. But at the same time, like how do you not have them like 25 to 1?
Right.
That's where I would put
This is
them.
saying Marquette is three times less likely to win it all than Gonzaga. What?
I mean, look at it from this standpoint too. We've already talked about the Big East. Worst case scenario, we're probably talking about Marquette as like a 4 seed if things don't go well.
Yeah.
They could potentially be a 1 or a 2 seed too. So even if they're like a 2 seed, let's say they don't end up getting to the one line, they end up as a 2 seed. Still, you'd have to give them some respect just for even being in that place in the bracket. So yeah, I think this one would be a total buy.
Yeah. I do worry about their depth. If I love Kansas's depth, I hate Marquette's depth. Hopefully Sean Jones gets back healthy. I know he's recovering from an ACL. He hasn't played yet. That would be a huge boost for them because right now they're relying on two very inefficient freshmen first off the bench, but they've been incredibly impressive. They're better with Cam Jones running the show than they were with Tyler Kolek, and they were very good with Tyler Kolek. Iowa State, slightly worse odds than Tennessee at 18 to 1, sixth on the AP poll. I feel like that's the same as Tennessee. Like that feels about right. I would maybe buy it if you force me to pick a lane, but I think they're a much better offensive team than they were the last 3 years under Otzelberger, but defense might not be as good. They've already given up. They gave up 83 and 84 in back-to-back games. They gave up 76 twice all of last season. So I was that the soft rims in Maui? Are they not as good on defense? We'll see, but I think seventh or eighth best odds is about right for the Cyclones.
Exactly where I'd expect them to be.
Gonzaga, that's a hardcore sell at third best odds, 12 to 1, if only because they're Gonzaga, right? Eventually they're going to win one, but I've also been burned so many times by picking Gonzaga to win it all.
I mean, really impressive against Baylor.
Yeah.
Arizona State, maybe not as impressive. A quality win, not a super quality win at home. Then you look at West Virginia, they lost on a neutral court. So do I think Gonzaga can turn it on? Sure. But back to that floor conversation, usually your national champion is a team with a very high floor. And Gonzaga has already shown us a couple times where maybe that floor isn't quite so high.
Yeah.
So that would be my concern with Gonzaga. Maybe from an efficiency standpoint, they look really, really good. I would still think Gonzaga should be in that conversation.
They should be top 10. They shouldn't be third.
I would have them like 5 or 6,
Yeah.
but third is too high for me.
Uh, Fun fact on Gonzaga. Now we are missing 18, 20 games worth of West Coast Conference data in here, but they are presently shooting their worst 3-point percentage since 1996. They're still top 50 in the nation in effective field goal percentage, but that concerns me. Purdue they're now 60 to 1. When I texted you last night, they were 75 to 1. Are you even buying them there though? At 60 to 1? No?
No.
Okay.
And to be honest, no. Because I think it gets into that who can I realistically see cutting down the nets? I can't even envision in my head Purdue cutting down the nets. I just don't think they have a realistic path to a national championship this year. Could it possibly happen? Of course, but like realistically, no.
Yeah. I think they're a very good three-man team. Kaufman Wren has been phenomenal stepping up, but they don't have the Matt Painter special. There's nobody taller than like 6'9" that I trust on that team. There's no Matt Harms, there's no Isaac Haas, there's no Zach Edey. We'll see. Duke 10 to 1, second best odds. I would sell them at this just because I've watched them absolutely collapse under pressure twice against Kentucky and Kansas. Granted, you can easily make all of the Cooper flag a 17. They'll get better as the season progresses. Certainly, of all these teams, they're the most freshman reliant. They should evolve the most, but I don't think they've done anything yet to show us that they should be second best. No, I think Ken Palm does have them as the second best team, though.
So I was trying to bury this one a little bit earlier. I think Duke should be number one. As far as most likely national champion.
So you're buying them?
I would buy them here. I think it should go Duke, Kansas, Auburn in order. Those are, and if you gave me those three versus the field, I think one of those three teams is going to win the national championship. I know from a statistical standpoint, these odds would tell you that's a terrible, terrible call. But what do I truly believe? I truly believe the national champion is going to be either Duke, Kansas, or Auburn. I think all three have shown that they can play at an elite level. And for Duke, what really impresses me is I don't think they played well against Kentucky.
Yeah.
And I don't think they played well against Kansas. And they still could have beaten Kentucky and Kansas. And when you look at Kentucky and Kansas, where's Duke going to see them? Probably at the earliest, a Sweet 16. More likely, they probably wouldn't see them till the Elite Eight or Final Four. So if they're not playing well in those games and they still could have won them, what does that tell you about Duke? I think Duke is about to just explode onto the stage when they play Auburn in Cameron Indoor, and people are going to say, oh my gosh, this Duke team is better than we thought. How did we underrate Duke of all teams? I think Duke's going to have a statement.
We'll see. Your point about them not playing, they're like Con Knipple shot like 0 for 8 from 3 against Kansas. Malawach was like no factor at all in that game. I know he's been dealing with knee cramp issues, but yeah, certainly their ceiling is the highest in the country. I think. I'm just they're not as good as I thought they would be, and their odds haven't changed since the season began. I think they should have slipped a little bit. I Yeah, I just can't buy them at 10 to 1. I don't know. Alabama 13 to 1, last team on the list. Really good on offense, really bad on defense. A little bit better on defense than last year, but kind of the same team. Where do you fall on Crimson Tide there? I think that's fourth best odds in the nation.
I don't believe in Alabama at 13 to 1. If you're putting them at 13 to 1, you're saying they should be above Kansas and basically equal with Gonzaga, and I just don't believe that. I think Bama should probably be more so in like that 17 to 1 area. So yeah, I would not have them at 13 to 1.
I agree. It's a tough sell, but it's a sell. All right, that's all we got. Are these your one seeds right now? Kansas, Auburn, Tennessee, and Kentucky?
Yeah, not my one seeds. In order, I have Auburn, Kansas, Tennessee, and then Marquette sneaking on to the one line.
I still have Gonzaga there, but that's like a placeholder for who wins the Gonzaga Kentucky game in 3 or 4 days. But we'll be back at some point. You're not going to the Dominican Republic again on me or anything?
Nope.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll get one up again within a week, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.